Welcome, specimen, to Tuesday's video. Today is the start of the 12th reset of 9.1, but we're not here to talk about anything happening in this reset. We are here to resume what we have been talking about since yesterday, which is thanks to this upcoming 9.1.5 patch, there are going to be new windows, new avenues for you to level up or to bring up to current content your other characters or your main character with different covenants. So being able to skip the entirety of the campaign, the entirety of the Cortia campaign, being able to farm boring and tedious stuff like redeemed souls, you can now do it endlessly in Torghast. Torghast being able to now give you soul ash and soul cinders for every clear, the full amount, so you will be able to catch up, for example, on crafted legendaries very quickly, as well as the ability, of course, to gain 40 renown instantly whenever you choose a covenant. So with this new catch-up system that is going to come out, there are going to be more ways for you to try out different characters, different specs. And, you know, whenever something like this happens, people start looking around, they start looking about other specs, other classes, trying out something new. And this is what we have done yesterday, looking at the melee DPS. So today, it's the day of the ranged. Now, the ranged DPS have something quite different compared to the melee DPS. Number one, the ranged DPS that you can choose are 2 less than the melee, and of these 11 available specs, 8 of them, 8 are just within 3 classes, Hunter, Mage, and Warlock. The only hybrids available, the only one-of available to ranged are Elemental, Shadow Priest, and Balanced Druid. When you go and look at the melee DPS, you had Windwalker, you had Survival, you have Red Paladin, you have Havoc, you had Feral, you had Enhancement. You had basically 50% of the entirety of your choice as a melee, as a one-of, as a hybrid pick. You had no backup, you had no second chance, you had no way out if you were choosing a spec and that spec turned out to be weak, or that spec turned out to be nerfed, or anything like that. You had no other option, but for ranged DPS, it's much different. So it is definitely the safer choice, because you are more likely to be able to find different specs within the same class that can fit whatever you're looking for. Talking about what you're looking for, we are going to be looking at a similar list of things like we did for the melee DPS, how popular they are, how likely they are to be chosen by the player base as a meta spec, what is their diversity and their choices and options within their specs or even their class. Are they stuck playing the same thing over and over, or do they get to change it and vary how they play? What about their damage profile? Are they full-on single target? Are they exclusively AoE? Can they do a little bit of both? And then we can look at some special things, some extra points at the end. Now, starting as usual with the popularity, with the meta points being given to these specs. Because there are so many different specs clumped within the same classes, the popularity can be kind of misleading. This is the popularity of the raids. So you will get to see that Balanced Druid is extremely popular, right, compared to all of the other specs. Then again, if you put together the Hunter specs and the Mage specs and the Warlock specs, all 3 of them are going to be at the same level or above Balanced Druid. This is particularly important because in 9.1.5 you will be able to respec within different specs of the same class much more easily, because you are no longer going to be gated by the same covenant. So for example, the Mage specs, who all play a different covenant. Now, it's a little bit harder for you to play all 3 of them, whereas in 9.1.5 is going to be much easier. So this popularity could be misleading. Either way, if we wanted to still look at how it's looking right now, especially if we add Mythic Plus popularity to the mix, then the most popular picks overall, the safest ones, would be Balanced Druid and the Hunter specs. Hunter has been overall, I would say the safest, just in general, is going to be Hunter. Hunter has basically always been present in raid encounters. It's like you're always going to want a Hunter, even though it's not bringing you a raid debuff, it's not bringing you a raid buff or anything special. It does have a sort of immunity, I guess, but a lot of guilds will just default to having at least 1 Hunter, maybe even 2, because of their ability to do mechanics and to move very quickly in raid encounters. So it is always a very wanted spec. It is doing fine in popularity in Mythic Plus. Balanced Druid has continued on this popularity level since the start of the expansion, basically, so not much has changed on that front. Those are easily the specs you would go for if you were looking, if you only cared about playing a class that you know is going to be popular. Now, if your interest was in playing a spec only, so I've been saying that if you put warlocks together and if you put mages together, they are still more popular overall, but what if you're only interested in one spec? You're like, yeah, sure, if you put all of the mage specs together, they can be the most popular in the game. The problem is, I hate Arcane and I hate Frost, and the only thing I care about is Fire. It's not that I want to play all of the mage specs together, I just wanted to play Fire. Or I was just interested in Demonology Warlock. It's not that I care if all of the Warlock specs together are super popular, I just cared about one. Well, in that case, then it's of course much more risky. You know, it's you know what you're getting into if you only want to play a single spec. BM, Marksmanship, Balance Druid are all very popular in Mythic Plus and in Raid Encounters. The closest one to them as a whole is Destruction Warlock when it comes to Raid plus Mythic Plus at the same time. The other specs would be much riskier to play. As I did for the melee DPS, if you were more into Mythic Plus, so if you knew you had your raid spot safe, and you just wanted to focus more on Mythic Plus, then Elemental Shaman would be a good pick for you to focus more on Mythic Plus. Whereas if you were more into Raid Encounters, you don't care about the Mythic Plus, you are one of those guys who is going to get his Keystone Master the first few weeks, and after that he's just gonna do a weekly key at best, right? So it's not really that Mythic Plus interests you, you're more of a raid guy, then one of the mage specs would be much better. At this moment, given the growth, given the more popularity it is having, Fire Mage would be a good pick, outside of the specs we already mentioned. Okay, fine. What about the diversity then? I don't care about the popularity. I'm gonna find a way to play the specs anyways. I have a guild, or I have a Mythic Plus group, or I just don't care. I'm not afraid of having to fight in the mud of the looking for group tool. I will find a way to play. Just tell me which of the specs give me more diversity overall. So for the most diverse you can go for right now, it's definitely Mage. Because as a whole right now you have Fire Mage playing Night Fae, you have Kyrian that is being played by Arcane, and then you have Frost Mage playing Ventir. So you have 3 different specs with 3 different covenants available. There is not going to be too much change within the specs themselves. They are pretty locked in their talent choices and in their legendary choices. It's not that they have a multitudes of them. Arcane is kind of stuck on a single legendary like Arcane Harmony. You have Frost Mage, who has a couple between Slick Ice and Freezing Winds. Fire Mage, after the hotfix, is kind of wiggling between Sun King's Blessing for single target and Disciplinary Command for AoE, but those are about the only variety choices they get to pick when you're looking at just the legendary options. The least varied as a whole is going to be Warlock, because it's basically the opposite of Mage. Whereas 3 Mage specs are playing 3 different covenants, the 3 Warlock specs are playing the exact same covenant. So if you were looking for diversity, if you wanted to play Warlock, you were excited about being able to try all 3 different specs, now you can finally play them all at once. They are not a melee spec, you don't need different types of weapons or anything like that. They are still all playing Night Fae. And also, what is worse, the other covenants are not looking viable at all right now, so it's kind of bad for Warlock. The hybrid specs have a little bit more room. You have Elemental, who used to play Necrolord, now is playing a little bit more Night Fae. They also can change, in terms of diversity, they can change their talents and their setup for AoE or for single target. You have Shadow Priest, who is also changing between Night Fae, going more into Necrolord, and you have Druid, who has moved away from Night Fae to go more towards Ventir. But overall, if you were looking for more diversity and for more options when you want to play a spec, then the easier option would be Mage as a whole, because it would allow you way more freedom within the different specs, as opposed to their counterpart Warlock, which is going to be the more rigid, the more stuck in its own setup. What about instead if you cared for damage profile, if you cared about the way you do damage, what way you do damage? As we talked about for the melee DPS, there are going to be some specs stuck to the extremes, doing either very, very high single target and poor AoE, or vice versa, or specs that can do sort of everything. Sometimes decently, sometimes badly. So first we have one side of the extreme, which is the AoE extreme. This is something we have covered once we went into our weekly look at raid encounters. You will have seen specs like Affliction, specs like Elemental, and specs like Marksmanship Hunter being very high when it comes to AoE bosses and very, very low when it comes to single target bosses, because this is what their damage profile is. They are much more leaning towards doing heavy AoE, and they have poor capabilities when it comes to single target. So this is your choice. If you're going to pick these specs, you're going to be wanted and needed, and you will have power when it comes to AoE scenarios compared to when you are looking for single target. This is going to be slightly more valuable when it comes to this type of damage profile, because then it's going to translate very well in Mythic Plus. Of course, Mythic Plus is, generally speaking, the land of the AoE, the constant AoE pack by pack. So is one of the reasons, for example, why Elemental has been growing so much in popularity, and why we have mentioned you might want to focus on Elemental if you were looking at Mythic Plus, because that's their niche now, their very high AoE damage. Then you also have the opposite of this. You have the more single target oriented builds like Shadow Priest, like Demonology Warlock. Those are the specs that are going to have fewer AoE capabilities, and they do much more when it comes to consistent single target damage. Those are the two specs that are way more focused and geared towards single target. The rest of the specs are much more fluid in the type of damage they can do. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It's not that it's by default better, that if they can do damage more effectively. Sometimes it's just gonna mean they can do more of everything at an average level. Things like Beast Mastery Hunter, things like Destruction, Warlock, Frost Mage, Arcane Mage, even Balanced Druid, they don't have a particular niche between single target and AoE. They can do both, never the best. You do have some smaller niches like Balanced Druid and their Ventir build when it comes to the burst single target in their cooldown window, or even Arcane Mage burst damage or Fire Mage burst damage, but they're not being mentioned as being a niche AoE or a niche single target build simply because they can do both. Whereas Elemental's AoE strength is nowhere near their single target strength. Even with the burst of Balanced Druid in single target, they still have functioning and viable AoE damage. So that's why they are not a particular niche, a particularly special type of damage profile. They can do most of everything when it comes to damage. So again, this is much more up to preference, up to whether or not you like being the special guy. You know, if you like being the go-to guy who is required to do single target, or the one they want for doing AoE, or if you're someone that doesn't have a specialty, doesn't have anything that might always require them to be used, but in return can always perform in every type of damage situation, whether it's 1 target, 3 targets, or 5 targets. So as an overall look at the situation, when it comes to damage profile, the more heavy AoE specs are going to be Elemental, Marksmanship, and Affliction Warlock. If it's more single target oriented, it's going to be Shadow Priest and Demonology Warlock. And if you want a more complete damage profile, a more overall balanced and healthy damage profile, Balanced Druid and Frost Mage would be your options. When you look at the choices and the options and the diversity you might want to look for in the classes and specs, mages as a whole have a lot of diversity if you look at a class in general. If you look at the specs one by one, then mage doesn't have too much individually. So you might want to look at something like Elemental Shaman or Shadow Priest would have more diversity within their spec only. If you look at the popularity instead, currently the more popular picks, the more wanted picks, and the more generally played are Beast Mastery, Marksmanship, and Balanced Druid. So we're going to finish the video with another bit of insight on the possible choice you might have, which is more personal, it's more individual, so it's likely going to be up to you to at least try out the spec rather than just trust me at face value, but that would be the complexity of the spec, how hard it is, because it might also be something that can sometimes drive people away if a spec is too complex, or maybe it is the opposite. Maybe you are okay with how popular or how not popular a spec is. You are okay with how diverse and how varied is the kit of the spec. You are also okay with the way it deals damage, the damage profile of the spec. However, you're not okay with how simple it is. You just wanted a little bit more of a challenge when playing the spec, or perhaps you are in the opposite camp. Perhaps you wanted a more simple spec to play. So nothing that you gauged the spec before with, like popularity or the type of damage they do, is going to be worth anything. So, of course, if we are talking about simplicity, if you're talking about easy to execute, you want to go for Beast Mastery or for Marksmanship. Those are the two simpler specs. You can also go for Destruction Warlock, which is also a very simple spec to execute. Talking about the diversity, this could actually be a good help for Warlock, because Warlock is not diverse, as we said. They are all very stuck in their own build with their own Covenant choice, but they are pretty diverse in the way they function, because Destruction is pretty simple, while Demonology is pretty complex, and Affliction is kind of in the middle. So it is pretty good if you wanted the diversity in terms of complexity, at the very least, if you are looking at Warlocks. Mage can also be somewhat similar, because Frost Mage is also very, very simple. Arcane Mage is also pretty easy to get into. The more complex one would be Fire Mage, especially, getting used to their minigame they have to play with Hot Streak. If you go and look at the three hybrid specs we left behind, Balance, Shadow Priest and Elemental, Shadow Priest would be the more complex one. They are the ones that have to juggle different things multiple times between the dots they have, the spender they have, and a few other things. It's generally speaking the more complex one. You have Elemental, which is on the easier side, especially now that you might want to be focused more on AoE. Before, if you were focused more, if the spec was more focused on single target, they were more complex, especially if you're playing with Ice Fury. You have to deal with quite a few things. The problem is, or rather, your saving grace is that the single target is so low, the single target of Elemental is so weak that it doesn't really matter if it's more complex in single target. You are playing it if you want to play it because of their AoE. Once you go in the AoE of Elemental, that is pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. And then you have the middle of the pack, which is Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid, if you want to play it, is very, very simple for most of its life, for most of its rotation, for most of what you want to do. Then it has a pretty high spike in difficulty, which is when you want to use its cooldowns. So a lot of your performance as a Balanced Druid is going to hinge on whether or not you can pull off that harder difficulty part properly. So with this outlook, is going to be up to you, whether or not you want to try a more challenging spec, or whether or not you want to go more safe. You want to go for a spec that you know is going to be easier to pick up and easier to play quickly and immediately. But that is still something very important. It's very important that you don't just choose a spec because you think it's popular, or choose a spec because you think it has the damage profile you want, like, say, I want to play Mythic Plus, therefore I'm going to be looking for a spec with tons of AoE, only to then discover that you think the spec is too simple and too boring, or that the spec is too complicated for you and you just can't get into it. So it's also something that it is worth considering when you're choosing a spec to play, just about its complexity or its lack of complexity. So with this, we are also done with the range DPS. We have added an extra category after the popularity, the diversity, the damage profile. Now we also have the complexity. We will likely have to go over this, likely when 9.1.5 is closer to launch, or slightly after, as we are going to prepare for 9.2, because there are going to be quite a few things changing. Maybe we're going to discover completely different things, like new combos, new ways of specs to play with different covenants that right now are very hard to discover, because there are not many people willing to just go and try out a different covenant. Nobody is willing to play covenants right now because they are considered weak, they are considered unplayable. But with 9.1.5, the fact that you will be able to do it for free is of course going to give much more incentives to players to try them out, for fun, which is cool, which is good. So for now, however, we have to stop here. This is all we know for the moment, so that's all we can do when it comes to giving you more insight and more details on your choice, on choosing a class or a spec to play. So thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the content and want to support the channel, you can subscribe, you can like, you can leave a comment down below about your current targets as the possible specs you're interested in playing. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, well, it was my bad complaining about 31 degrees yesterday, because today it's 32. Fuck me.